Coming up on the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE with an in-depth analysis on how it impacts you. Plus, we are talking about some key issues with public education, both here in California and happening in Washington, D.C. We've got two great reporters on to talk about what's happening right now and what has happened in 2025.
The ACSA Legislative Lunch Break starts now.
And it's just after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with Dr. Edgar Zazwata, ACSA's Executive Director. I'm Naj and Edgar, ACSA's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Welcome. We are honored to have you back after the Thanksgiving holiday, and we gave you last week off as well because we figured getting back to school after the holiday was, you needed a little extra time. But we're happy to have you with us. Edgar, I have to ask you, how was your Thanksgiving holiday?
Gosh, Thanksgiving feels like it was a month ago.
Yeah.
It was a busy week last week. It was good. It's always one of those, it might go down. I know we make a big deal about it, the holidays in December here, but I think I'm a Thanksgiving person. Food, family, sports. Yeah, it was a good one. And then last week, I know we spent a lot of time had a lot of members here in our backyard in Sacramento for which I think becomes the biggest education conference, at least here in California. Our friends at the California School Boards Association had their big annual conference, which ends up being like our conference too, just because with so many of our members, superintendents, and others there as well. Now, there was a big hot take. I know we talk about geography a lot here on this show.
Yeah,
Let's Northern California. People have stopped me and giving me their perspective on that. I'm not gonna go back to that debate today about where Sacramento is or where does the Southern California, Northern California start. But there was a lot of hot takes on whether people liked having a big conference in Sacramento or not.
Okay.
I know for some of the native, I'm an adopted son of Sacramento, so
right.
My feelings aren't always hurt on that end, but there's some pretty strong feelings that we'll leave for another day there.
I was just gonna ask, could you give us any of the comments that you heard with respect to that? But I also know we're talking about superintendents and board members, so maybe we want to just back away from
Well, I will call out one of our colleagues here. I was walking along the street with Ivan Carrillo, our great senior director of policy and government relations, Sacramento native, right? Mm-hmm. Born and bred here, loves all the teams. You know the story. Some member, I think from Southern California, stopped him and said, "Okay, give me some of the things I must do that I have to do here in Sacramento while I'm here." Ivan couldn't give him one thing. People give him a hard time when you see Ivan relay that story.
Absolutely. That's not the best Sacramento Chamber of Commerce moment right there.
The Board of Tourism is not going to hire.
Yeah,
Ivan.
Exactly. Folks, coming up, we've got two great reporters on national and California reporters to talk about what is happening right now in public education. What are the big stories right now? Then kind of a look at 2025 and 2026 as we move into the budget process. So we'll talk with two reporters coming up in just a couple of moments. First off, I want to give you some news headlines. We'll start with the State Attorney General, Rob Bonta. He's updated and begun distributing the guidance model policies to supporting districts with implementation of Assembly Bill 49. Just as a reminder to all of you, 49 states that schools can't allow an officer or an employee of an agency conducting immigration enforcement to enter a non-public area of a school or a school site for any reason without presenting a valid judicial warrant, judicial subpoena, or court order. The report titled Promoting a Safe and Secure Learning Environment for All, we've made it available. It's going to be on our comment section, so you can click the link after the show and take a look at that. We do have some good news, Edgar. I'm happy to report this about our rural California schools. Congress has approved the Secure Rural Schools Act. This act provided funding to schools that are surrounded by non-taxable federal land, according to the Los Angeles Times. Our good friend Jamie Green would be very happy about this one. Congress has approved that funding until 2027. Now, there has been bipartisan support for this funding for like the longest time, right? But Congress, they couldn't come to an agreement. It expired a while ago. Now, if President Trump signs it, it's going to extend the program and provide retroactive payments. Again, during the time that Congress could not come to an agreement on it. One last thing, Edgar, and this is a great story. We'll take you to Elk Grove. Over at Laguna Creek High School, students worked through the night to pack 20,000 meals that'll be donated for the holidays. There you go, some photos from that. The meals are part of Rise Against Hunger, an international initiative run by a coalition of student groups, Rotary, and National Honor Society. This is the second time Laguna Creek students have participated in this program, and those meals are being sent to Vietnam to support families that were impacted by major floods and landslides this year. Edgar, it is just that time of giving, and it is so great to see what the students over at Laguna Creek High School did for those families in Vietnam. 20,000 meals is an incredible.
I love that. Our neighbors here at Laguna Creek. I think some of you know. I coach high school soccer here in Sacramento. We're just playing Laguna Creek here in a couple days, so we'll have to be nice to them. But no, that's awesome. This reminds me of credit to you and Michael. Throwback to, I think it was our COVID days when we would make an effort to once in a while. It doesn't always have to be bad news around here, Naj. Some good news, especially in the look at you in the holiday spirit, finding a good story. The last two stories were good, so absolutely. I appreciate that, and the students doing some good work, and then credit to a lot of our members there of getting an advocacy win with the Rural Schools Act there. Yeah, absolutely. Hey, want to point out Rusty Gordon first on our chat today. I'm looking through the list. Mary Stark with us today, Laura Dutch. This one I think is interesting, Edgar, our good friend Neri, only because you and I are supposed to be on this meeting as well. Neri is doing double duty. He is on a meeting, but also watching Ledge Lunch Break. So Neri, thank you. Please take notes because Edgar and I are going to join that meeting in like 22 minutes. But much appreciation for that. Edgar, so much has happened in public education in 2025. We've covered so much of it here on the lunch break, including breaking news. But there's also a lot to look forward to as we move into the budget process, not just here in California, but also in Washington, D.C. So we've got two great reporters on with us. Carolyn Jones, education reporter at Cal Matters, and Matt Barnum, education reporter at chalkbeat.org. Carolyn and Matt, so good to have both of you here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Matt, let me start with you. We've spent much of this year discussing the proposals to dismantle the Department of Education, reassign those programs to other agencies, and return control over to the states. From the conversations that you're having with educators nationwide, how are they responding to this approach?
I don't think most educators are thrilled by this. Now, there's 3 million teachers and many more other folks who work in education who are educators. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of concerns about like, well, what does this mean? Does this mean we're going to lose funding? What does this mean for students with disabilities? What does this mean for Title I? Now, what's interesting is that the administration has said, well, we're just moving the programs. We're not going to get rid of the programs. Your Title I funding, Linda McMahon, Education Secretary Linda McMahon, has specifically said that Title I and IDEA funding will be protected. We will see how it plays out. We do know from the Trump administration's proposed budget that they do want to cut some funding, federal funding for schools, not Title I or IDEA, but other funding sources. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now.
Carolyn, as I mentioned, first of all, thank you for both of you for joining us as always. So I mentioned, last week was at the CSBA conference, and I feel like it almost felt like, it's some recency bias, but like every meeting that I was in, somebody was bringing up this report from the Policy Analysis for California Education, or PACE, as we refer to it here. This report that they just came out about, really thinking of reshaping how we would think about governance here in California. Does it make sense to have a separate SPI. You have, the State Board of Education. Should the governor have more oversight? Kind of really changing things about how we would structure the governance system to support our schools. Obviously that this has a long way. It had to go through process and legislative review and whatnot. But if this was to happen, with such a change, what do you think about the interaction here, or the conversations we're having at the federal front? What authorities to the states, or really what's the aim from everybody you've talked to or think? I know you folks have done some reporting broadly on this subject. What are you hearing on just these efforts to rethink how we do things here in California?
Well, I think the timing is really interesting because as there's so many changes going on at the federal level, there is more and more power going to the states. The smaller the federal Department of Ed is, the more responsibility the states are going to have. So the topic is really timely right now. However, I think that the idea of kind of reshuffling the governance in California goes back a long time. It definitely predates Trump. I mean, it goes back for, I don't know, probably a century. As long as we've had schools, there's been disputes over who should run them and how. And California does have this really weird system. I mean, as long as I've been covering education, it's always struck me as really kind of this confusing, incoherent, many-headed hydra, with the governor and the state superintendent and the State Board of Education and the legislature. And then California is very big on local control. So local school boards have an awful lot of power. So decisions are getting made at all different levels. And sometimes these policies contradict each other, or they're not super clear. And so it leads to a real lack of accountability. It's always kind of unclear who's responsible for what and whose fault something is and who to call. Like, if something's not working, who's really in charge? It's sometimes really hard to know. And also it's very hard to make changes with this weird system we have. It's really hard to get all these different parties on board with something. So the PACE report kind of looked at a really kind of a bigger picture way to address that. One thing they suggested was not getting rid of the state superintendent. I know there's been some bills in the legislature that have suggested that over the years. We're one of only about a dozen states nationwide that has an elected state superintendent. So PACE is suggesting keep the state superintendent, but maybe change the job title, change the duties a little bit. Like have that person be more in charge of accountability and maybe not run the Department of Ed, maybe have someone appointed by the State Board of Education who has experience in administration actually running the Department of Ed. So that's one of the main suggestions they made.
Folks, Carolyn Jones, education reporter at Cal Matters, Matt Barnum, education reporter at chalkbeat.org, joining us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. If you have questions for either of them, go ahead and put those into the chat. Matt, earlier this year, the Trump administration paused several programs for internal review. We talked a lot about that here on this show. And while many of those programs have been remained intact because there's already been congressionally approved funding, future budgets could put them at risk. What do you anticipate with these programs moving forward?
It's definitely an open question. I mean, if we look at history, the prior Trump administration always proposed cutting budgets for schools, and they really didn't make any progress. Cutting federal funding, and even when Republicans controlled Congress, it was basically flat funded. It was maybe a bit of a cut with inflation, but not the deep cuts the Trump administration wanted. So you could predict that there won't be the cuts that the administration wants. But the politics of education have changed, and I think it's an open question to see. And it's certainly I wouldn't rule it out whatsoever that there could be cuts to these programs.
Carolyn, just like we talk about the holidays here in December, it feels like almost every year for all of us that watch the state budget every year, we're usually talking about a projected deficit, right? From the legislative analysts. Once in a while we've gotten lucky for a couple of years, but more often than not, we've been talking about just kind of some of these structural challenges that we have in terms of the budget. With the federal budget uncertainty, with state finances, as we've seen tightening, what's the context you folks are giving what are you giving your readers about what is the magnitude from your perspective of this deficit? How will, how do you see it potentially impacting the conversations next year and ultimately how impacting schools?
Well, it seems like it's early days still, right? I mean, the budget fights are going to be going on for months, and we're just at the very beginning of it. And so sometimes everyone starts out saying, oh my God, we have no money, and then suddenly money appears, or vice versa. The Legislative Analyst Office did come out, I think it was about a week ago, and said the state is projected to have a budget deficit of, I think, 16 billion. But they also came out with a report that school funding looks okay. And in the past, Governor Newsom has pretty much preserved school funding, including, community schools and, all the other school lunches, all the extras, after school programs. So far schools have been pretty unscathed, but this is early still. I mean, a lot could happen between now and May. So I'm just kind of keeping an eye on it and hearing what people have to say. And then a lot will change on the federal level as well, as to what Matt was saying. It's kind of early. We still don't know exactly how the funding issues are going to pan out on the federal level, but that will obviously have a huge impact on state funding as well.
Matt, give me the major national education issue that our school leaders should be aware of, whether it's just small right now and will kind of percolate, or something that we're not even expecting.
So this is kind of like one that is percolating in small corners, and we'll see if it just dies down. But I wrote recently about a new nostalgia in some corners for No Child Left Behind. I'm sure your listeners and members do not have such a strong nostalgia for it, but there are some policy wonks who are like, look, we saw test scores rising in the early 2000s when No Child Left Behind was implemented. And I wanted to look at the research on this, and there was some evidence that No Child Left Behind did drive gains in math, but also drove more teaching to the test, drove more cheating, drove parents and some teachers crazy. And so there's this sort of policy wonk world that is sort of talking about, well, here's what we need is more federal accountability, pressure on schools related to test scores. Now, I don't think that's going to happen during this the Trump administration that wants to send education back to the states. But there is sort of a growing discussion of that. And, your members might want to be aware that is percolating.
That's an interesting one. I hadn't heard that, but that, just like all things that are old, sometimes, even on the scholarly front, right?
Exactly. It comes back around.
Yeah. Carolyn, so to you, obviously watching California pretty closely, what do you think? What are the issues that you're kind of looking forward to 2026 that might be major topics that folks should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, well, the number one, obviously, is elections. I think we have a lot of elections this year, and I think they're all pretty important as far as how schools are going to, what the outlook for schools. We're going to have a new state superintendent of public instruction. Tony Thurmond will be termed out after 2 terms, so that'll be a big deal. And there's kind of a wide field of candidates right now, so I'll be looking closely at that. And then also the midterms nationwide. I think depending of Congress, if there's a change of the makeup in Congress, that could have a big impact on Trump policies going forward, and therefore on what happens at schools. And then local school board races, I'm going to be looking really closely. I mean, last time around, we sort of saw a surge of kind of more conservative or Republican candidates taking control of school boards and changing the direction of that school board. I'm going to see if that's going to continue this time around, or maybe it's going to switch. And then bonds, everyone's bored by bonds, but not me. I love school bonds. So I'm going to be looking really closely at, how that works and who, what districts are able to get their bonds passed and which are going to be stuck with leaky roofs for another couple of years. And then other issues I'm looking at outside of elections. The number 2 thing is what goes on at the federal level with the Department of Ed. I think that, how that plays out over the next couple months or year is going to be huge. And school closures and declining enrollment, we're seeing that being a really big deal in definitely in Oakland, West Contra Costa, LA. I've noticed it's really associated with a lot of labor upheaval too. Yeah. Teachers don't like it. And so I think that that's going to continue to be a really do or die situation for a lot of districts. Literacy, there's a lot of literacy initiatives that are getting going, and I'm going to check to see, how those are doing, if they're working or not working. And then culture wars, DEI stuff, especially related to LGBTQ students. I think, it'll be like in the past few years, that's been a real issue in some parts of the state. And I'm going to keep following that to see if that's going to continue to have that kind of impact.
Yeah, you read my mind when you were talking about the school closures, where my mind quickly went, because I think it's one of the things we're going to be looking out for. Obviously, we know about the strike in Contra Costa, and I know this is something where we're keeping a real close eye. Is just the rising, I think, labor turmoil, and how I know that's heating up, and I know there's an effort to try to unify bargaining from our partners at CTA. So what's that's gonna mean for statewide? So yeah, one other question for you, Carolyn, and Matt, feel free to jump in. This is kind of a national question with kind of California centric question. Whether our governor has announced it or not, it's very clear that there's national aspirations there, right? I can't go on to my podcast with him being on a different podcast or a different show these days. So both. I'll ask it to you first, Carolyn, and if you have anything to add on the national landscape. What do you think for us here in California, having the governor entering his last year as the executive here in California, but with his national kind of lens, what do you think that'll mean for some of the governing and policies here in the next year?
Well, I think that he's going to want to be able to point to his record in California. And, people everywhere care about their schools, right? And so I think he's going to want to say, look, our schools are great. And so that could be really good for schools in California. I mean, he has funded a lot of initiatives that have been pretty successful. Community schools are really popular. TK, the rollout of universal TK has been a really big deal. And test scores are kind of gradually creeping up after COVID, which is good. So I think he'll be pointing to that. But at the same time, I think other candidates who are going to be jockeying for that job are also going to want to, say, I can do better. So that's what I'd be looking for.
Matt, maybe I'll throw a little bit different spin on the question. Just, as you're looking at the national landscape, I know this is something that we always struggle with. How much is education going to be talked about as we enter like the midterms, and then even looking ahead to the next presidential cycle? Given what you're seeing, how much do you think education will be at the forefront of the conversation?
What I think is very interesting is that we saw in 2024, and even a little before, that you had Republicans in Trump talking about education a lot. Whereas you heard very little from then President Biden or Kamala Harris about education. And one, that's very striking, just generally as an asymmetry. And two, it's striking because Democrats have historically led on education as an issue. And actually, contrary, some people have said, oh, they've lost that lead. And I looked into it. And no, they haven't. They're still trusted more on education, but they don't talk about it that much. And so there are a lot of Democrats who are now saying, and a lot of pundits at the national level who are saying, Democrats, you need to talk about education a whole lot more. You need to reclaim this issue. You need to have a clear agenda. Now, I think different Democrats are going to take that and run with it in different ways. We see Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago, who's hinted at running or suspected to be running, taking it in a very different way and saying, Democrats, you need to talk less about culture war issues. You need to focus on phonics. You need to focus on sort of getting back to the basics, a sort of old school reform agenda. Maybe even, he hasn't used this language, but maybe even a no child left behind style accountability agenda. You have Andy Beshear, the governor of Kentucky, who's also said that he's considering running, saying, you know what, we need to invest in public schools. We need to reject vouchers. We need to reject charter schools. And I'm very interested about, Gavin Newsom, because I followed him a little bit, and I don't really know where he lands on that and what his sort of like bumper sticker education message is. I mean, maybe you guys can tell me, because I haven't heard him really lean into that as an issue, as, in the podcast, in his sort of test run. But obviously it's been a big part of his governance, because it has to be when you're the governor.
No, that's a great question. That's a great piece for discussion piece, right? Because I think he has doubled down on some of the pieces that have been foundational here for California, the local control piece. Right. I think he'll obviously, like to Carolyn's point, he's going to tout, the money that's gone to schools, the investment. But in terms of a reform perspective, and I know Kent's, I have been listening to the podcast just to hear what's coming out. Now, I think he's been really keen on taking some of those perspectives that are maybe from the other side, that are not non-traditional, Democratic perspective. So I'll be interested to see what his national perspective becomes there in terms of what it means for schools.
Yeah, I'll be especially curious if he, does he stake out a position on charter schools? Does he stake out a position on sort of accountability testing? Does he stake out a position on science of reading? All those things could signal where he lands on this.
All right. Well, Carolyn Jones, education reporter, Cal Matters, and Matt Barnum, education reporter at chalkbeat.org. We're going to put into the comment section a link to Chalkbeat, so you can go ahead and take a look at that publication. Carolyn and Matt, thanks so much for being with us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. We'll see you next time.
Thanks
for having us.
Bye.
Edgar, I want to ask, because I think it would be good to just obviously summarize, because we heard some really interesting things there from both of our great reporters. But as you look at 2025 and ahead to 2026, I mean, how do you look at things? Are there themes that stick out to you after this entire year? Is there a theme that you look at as we head into 2026, just through your lens? Give me your ideas.
I mean, I think they both touched on it, and I think there's going to be a lot of conversations about change, right? And I think I think the political conversation, given that we're in an election year, given that next year here in California, as Carolyn pointed out, we're going to have, SPI gubernatorial elections. With that, we saw that last week already in a lot of these sessions at CSDA, which, I'll say what I said to a number of folks. For me, it was interesting. I went to some of these candidate forums, and you had a lot of Sacramento folks, right? Folks who have come up at held office, being key offices of like Sacramento and state office, being pretty critical of quote unquote Sacramento. And when I say Sacramento, I don't mean the critiques about, the conference or anything. I mean, I think the institution of state government, right? And what things can be done. So I think there's going to be a lot of conversations about here in California, what's working, what do we need to tweak, and then that expand it out to the national level, because there is going to be midterm elections, because we're going to have more of these folks who potentially, like a Gavin Newsom and others, maybe getting a little bit more serious and putting themselves out that they're looking at the presidential office a couple of years later. So I think it's going to be, the theme is going to be change. What people are proposing to modify from the trajectory that we're on, whether it be on a state level or at a federal level. That would be my prediction. You could tell me if I was right or wrong a year from now.
Hey, no problem. I have no problem in telling you when your predictions were incorrect. And I want to point out, because Neri, who's on 2 meetings right now, this show and then another meeting put on there uncertain times ahead for economy and education, which gives me the opportunity to let you know, Patty Herrera, School Services of California, a member of the Lunch Break 5-Timers Club, will be on the show next week to talk about the LAO's budget forecast and then the budget process coming up after that. Folks, want to tell you about our Every Child Counts Symposium. It's coming up in San Diego in January. One of the keynotes for that event will be the Holderness family. Many of you probably know the Holderness family from some of the great videos that they've produced. They've also won The Amazing Race. We sat down with the Holderness family to hear a little bit about their journey and what they'll talk about at our conference.
What I'm doing now, and the job that I have, and the platform that I have, and the fact that I'm here talking to you guys, is because of my ADHD, not in spite of it. I think a lot of people talk about succeeding in spite of this. You cannot ignore the positive sides of this sort of brain. Any neurodiverse child is going to have probably a tough time understanding that when they are, let's say, 8. But look at me, big smiles, very happy. Like, a better world with ADHD is out there for every child.
That's our Every Child Counts Symposium, January 12th through 14th in San Diego. You can register today by clicking over and taking a screenshot, take a photo of that QR code, or you can go to ACSA.org/professional-learning for more. I do want to point out, Rusty Gordon put into the chat They just posted a hilarious video on homework, so go ahead and take a look at that. Folks, if you like what you've seen here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, we invite you to like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, and now we're on LinkedIn as well. When you do, when you turn your notifications on, you'll get instant alerts when Edgar and I are going to come on for breaking news. And of course, you'll get a reminder about our regularly scheduled Wednesday show. And if you like if you have great stories happening in your community, just like the one we talked about over at Laguna Creek High School in Elk Grove earlier in the show, send your photos, your news releases, your talking points to Michelle Carl, mcarl at ACSA.org. Again, Edgar, you and I on next week with our good friend Patty Herrera to talk all things budget. You and I are 31 minutes late for a meeting, so we will hop on over there. Folks, thanks so much for joining us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Remember, we are live and interactive Wednesdays here on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Have a great rest of the day and rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.